She's not really military. She's just a smart girl who couldn't make it in the real world. That's what my father once told a colleague loud enough for my cousin to overhear at a backyard barbecue. I was 23, then newly assigned to intelligence command. The words found their way back to me through family gossip, polished, repeated, slightly sanitized, but they lodged deep, sharp, and unmovable. It's been almost a decade since, but tonight his voice echoed inside me, louder than the music spilling from the chandelier dining room of my sister's mansion. I stood on Vanessa's doorstep, a bottle of Chilean red in one hand, overnight bag in the other, and forced myself to ring the bell. The house, perched in the heart of Seattle's wealthiest suburb, gleamed like a wedding cake, flawless, towering, sickeningly sweet. Luxury cars dotted the driveway, a perfect line of privilege. Mine, a rented compact, looked like an apology. Vanessa opened the door in silk and gold. "Oh, you made it," she said, tone cool as her marble foyer. Her eyes skimmed over my plain sweater and slacks. "Still keeping it." "Low-key, I see." I smiled, tight professional. "It's good to see you too, Vanessa." Some part of me still craved approval. That part should have died years ago. Brian, her husband, always too polished and too proud, took the wine with a grin. "Army's treating you well, huh? You look rested." That word again, rested, as if I were on permanent vacation. I had returned from a 10-month deployment just last week. My body still twitched in sleep, as if the desert hadn't let me go. Vanessa waved toward the stairs. "Your room's upstairs. The small 1-second door on the left. We're saving the suite for Uncle Ron and Aunt Lila." I nodded. Of course. I knew the pecking order I always had. The guest room was narrow and cold, with a twin bed and a window that stared into the neighbour's fence. I set my bag down and caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror uniform, hung at home, but the posture stayed. Eyes tired, mouth set. Still the other daughter, despite my rank. Still not real enough for them. Downstairs, the party shimmered with curated joy. Vanessa's event planning firm had outdone itself. String lights over the garden, crystal glassware, name cards in scripted gold. Everyone had their place. Mine was next to Uncle Thomas, the man who once asked if I ever shot someone in the face yet. On my other side, Amanda, the cousin with the fiancé who called me G.I. Jen as a joke. Vanessa was everywhere radiant, praising everyone's accomplishments like a queen distributing coins. Dad's new record on the golf course. She beamed. Emma's recital flawless, of course. She skipped over me like a pebble in a river. Dinner was a pageant. Duck confit, truffle potatoes, a menu printed on thick linen paper. "Jennifer's still doing that army thing," Uncle Thomas said, nudging me with his elbow. "Bet you've got a million stories. Ever disarmed a bomb?" Before I could answer, Vanessa laughed the practiced kind. "Oh, please. Eleanor's job is mostly paperwork. Right. Reports and forms. She's not on the front lines or anything." Some guests chuckled. Amanda nodded sympathetic. "We need people like that, behind the scenes." My chest tightened. I steadied my fork. Don't react. Don't show the wound. But then, Vanessa added casually, "We're planning a family cruise next summer. Mom, Dad, Brian's parents. It'll be amazing. I wasn't invited. Not that I could have gone, my schedule made that impossible. But still." The deliberate omission stung like cold air in an open cut. I sipped my wine, said nothing. Then, just as Vanessa lifted her glass for another toast, the doorbell rang. She frowned. "We're not expecting anyone?" Brian went to check. Conversation shifted. Someone complimented the drapery. Another asked about the wine. And then, "Someone's here for Jennifer." Brian said, confused, "Military guy." The room stilled. Boots clicked down the hallway. He stepped into view, tall, composed cap under his arm. Daniel. Vanessa's son, her pride, her prodigy. 24 years old and a military pilot, just promoted to lieutenant. the one thing she bragged about endlessly. He scanned the room, found me, and with a crisp, unmistakable motion, he saluted. "Major Eleanor Carter, United States Special Operations Command," he said loud and clear. Silence cracked across the table. Vanessa's mouth parted. Dad's fork clattered against china. Margaret's hand froze mid-air. "Apologies for the interruption," Ma'am Daniel continued. "But Colonel Ramsay sent me to brief you. It's urgent." And just like that, the room flipped, not because I raised my voice, not because I defended myself, but because the one person Vanessa loved most had shown them who I was. Not just a smart girl who couldn't make it, not the quiet one, but a major, a leader, someone who didn't need their applause to be real. I stood, returned his salute, my voice steady. "Lieutenant Evans, let's step outside." And as we walked out, I saw it. For the first time in 32 years. Vanessa had no words. Dad had no defense. And the empty seat beside me wasn't empty anymore. But as Daniel's boots echoed down the hallway and I followed him out into the cool evening air, I felt something deeper stirring, not pride, not vindication, but the ghost of every moment I'd once sat at that table and gone unnoticed. The victory didn't erase the years. It only illuminated them more clearly. And suddenly I wasn't 32 and composed in my slacks and stiff spine. I was 8 small, unsure, and watching the world from behind my sister's shadow. Back then, our house in North Seattle looked like the kind you'd see on real estate postcards, neatly trimmed lawn shutters painted to match the mailbox, a tire swing that only Vanessa used. I was the quiet kid always drawing in the corner, sketching trees with roots too deep and skies too dark. Dad, when he noticed, called it moody. Margaret. Back then, she was just Linda, not yet stepmom, not yet polished into her perfect pearls and hostess smiles, thought it was concerning. Once in 2nd grade, I painted a portrait of my mum. Not Margaret, not the woman who came later. My real mum. Dark hair, sad eyes, a blue scarf tied around her neck, because that's all I could remember from the photos they never displayed. When I showed it to Margaret at the kitchen table, she frowned without looking up from her planner. "Eleanor, this is unsettling. Maybe next time draw flowers or a sunset, something cheerful. This feels not very ladylike." Her voice held that lacy disapproval she mastered so early, like she could wound you, and still sound like a teacher correcting a spelling mistake. Vanessa, meanwhile, had just come home from a school debate tournament with another first-place ribbon. She dropped her backpack, barely looked at my drawing, and said, "She looks like she's at a funeral." Then walked off. I still remember how cold the kitchen tile felt under my bare feet as I stood there holding that painting like it was a secret I wasn't supposed to love. Linda, Margaret, sorry always said she raised us the same, but even at 5 I knew that wasn't true. Vanessa got hair ribbons and praise, I got chore charts and silence. Her report cards were framed, mine tucked into drawers. Dad called her my little architect when she built things out of Lego, but when I solved a math puzzle 3 grades above my level, he just nodded and said, "You get that from your mother," like it was a genetic glitch, a throwaway compliment tied to a memory he never wanted to unpack. There's a family photo that Margaret used to keep on the mantel right next to her Waterford vase. Vanessa's 10th birthday, a garden party, everyone in white linen. When I finally studied the picture as a teenager, I noticed something strange. I was in it, but barely. Just the edge of my head half cropped, like I'd leaned in too late or wasn't meant to be there. Vanessa stood, dead, centre crown of daisies on her head, Margaret behind her beaming like she'd birthed a queen. Dad with his arm around them both. I was off to the side as if I'd photobombed my own family. That image haunted me more than I'd like to admit. It summed up everything. Not overt cruelty, just a constant quiet deletion. My place always peripheral. Not unloved, perhaps, but unimportant. The thing about being the background is you start to shrink yourself. You learn to be useful, not loud. You offer help, you clear the dishes, you ask how everyone else is doing, and never mention your own bruises. You become so good at blending in that even when you're in the center of the storm, they'll still ask where you've been. That's what it was like through most of high school. Vanessa by then was in college, already living in Seattle, already climbing the golden ladder. Margaret told everyone at church how proud she was. When they asked about me, she smiled politely and said, "Elena's very bright. We're still figuring out what she wants to do." As if I were a misplaced file she hadn't gotten around to organising yet. I once brought home a trophy from a state science fair. Built a working prototype for an energy-efficient water filter. Dad didn't even ask how it worked. He said, "That's great, honey." "Did Vanessa call today?" I laughed in the bathroom mirror that night, brushing my teeth like I was scrubbing away the want. It wasn't that Vanessa tried to sabotage me. No, that would have been easier. At least then she'd have had to acknowledge me. It was her indifference that cut deeper. The way she made success look so effortless, so curated. Every birthday party a masterpiece. Every college break an opportunity to network. Meanwhile, I spent my weekends tutoring kids at the library, poring over military strategy books, wondering if there was a world where logic and quiet competence actually mattered. That world didn't exist in our house. It existed in barracks, in dark briefing rooms, in the silent language of operations where words weren't necessary if your analysis saved lives. But all that came later. For now, standing outside Vanessa's glittering mansion, Daniel beside me, the silence from the dining room, still hanging thick like fog, I felt it. That old ache curling up inside me like a warning, don't get used to this. One salute doesn't erase the photos you were cropped out of. Still, I let myself breathe. Just once. Because tonight, for the first time, the narrative cracked. They'd seen me. Not completely. Not fully. But enough to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been the background after all. That decision came the summer I turned 18. Just after high school, ended in a haze of quiet congratulations and overlooked milestones. Vanessa had already been featured in a local magazine for launching her first charity gala. Margaret clipped the article, laminated it, and set it on the living room table like a sacred text. Dad bragged about it to anyone who'd listen at the hardware store. Meanwhile, my name had appeared in smaller print winner of the state logic competition, volunteer hours recognised by the mayor's office, but no one at home ever mentioned it. It was at the community centre of all places where something shifted. I'd been volunteering there for over a year, mostly tutoring underprivileged kids in math and science. One afternoon, a mock leadership drill was held, an emergency response simulation. I was asked to lead the team. I mapped strategy, assigned roles, predicted outcomes. It felt natural, like I was building something invisible, a pattern beneath the noise. After the exercise, a man in a clean-pressed polo approached me. He was older, silver-haired, sharp eyes. "You've got a mind for systems," he said, voice gravelly but calm. "Not many your age can see patterns in chaos." I blinked. It made sense. He extended his hand. "Colonel James Whitaker? Retired? Used to train analysts at Fort Lewis. You ever thought about the military?" I laughed. "Me? No. My family would probably faint." He tilted his head. "That's a shame. Intelligence needs people who see what others don't. Not everyone needs to be loud to lead." That sentence clung to me like a second skin. For the next few weeks, I did research in secret. I visited recruiters, asked hard questions. The idea of wearing a uniform, of being part of something precise, calculated, purpose-driven, felt like a rebellion wrapped in discipline. A world where merit mattered more than showmanship. The night I told my family, it was over dinner. Margaret had made coq au vin. Vanessa was home for the weekend with Mark, her boyfriend at the time. The table, as usual, was hers. "I've made a decision," I said, careful, steady. "I've enlisted. Military intelligence program. I ship out in August." Fawkes paused, glasses lowered. Dad looked at me, expression unreadable. Then, fine. Just don't do anything that makes Vanessa look bad. My stomach twisted. That was his concern. Vanessa arched an eyebrow. You? Military? What, you're going to wear combat boots and bark orders? That's cute. Mark, trying to smooth things over, said, It's honourable, I guess. But Vanessa leaned back, her voice dipped in amusement. You in uniform? That's going to look like cosplay. Eleanor, Halloween came early? They laughed. Even Margaret let out a breathy chuckle. I didn't flinch, I didn't argue. I just looked down at my plate and memorised the pattern on the china, the way the gold rim faded just slightly near the edge. I anchored myself to that image so I wouldn't scream. Inside, my voice burned. If they won't see me for what I am, I'll go where their gaze can't reach. I'll disappear into a world they can't dismiss. I'll become something they're not allowed to laugh at. That was the last family dinner I attended before basic training. Later that night, after the dishes had been cleared and the house quieted into low murmurs, I stood alone in the backyard watching the porch lights flicker. The air smelled like rosemary and overcooked wine. From inside, I heard Margaret's voice climbing as she gushed about Vanessa's next big gala. I felt like a ghost in my own skin. Then, the door opened behind me. Vanessa. She stepped onto the patio glass of wine, in hand eyes unreadable. You're really going through with this, yes? You always had a thing for extremes, either hiding in your room for days or signing up for a war zone. I didn't answer. She sipped. Honestly, I don't get it. You could have done research or academia, something less dramatic. I turned toward her. And you think fashion shows for billionaires aren't? She almost smiled, touché. Then she said something quieter, maybe almost kind. Just don't expect people to clap for you. The army won't make you visible, Eleanor. It'll bury you deeper. I met her eyes. I'm not doing this to be seen. I'm doing it because someone finally did. She didn't know what that meant. I didn't explain. That night, I couldn't sleep. At 3 a.m, I found myself driving back to the community centre. It was closed, but Colonel Whitaker's car was already there, parked beneath the streetlight like a sentinel. Couldn't sleep? He asked. I shook my head. Too many voices. He handed me a thermos. Let them talk. You already crossed the line. I laughed low, almost bitter. Funny. That's what my sister thinks I'll be doing. Paperwork. He didn't smile. Let her. You're not doing this for her. I stared out across the field, dew glinting under the light. Part of me is. Then make sure you do it right. Leave so cleanly they'll never again know how to underestimate you. His voice was steel wrapped in grace. I gripped the thermos. If they couldn't see me, I'd create a world where their gaze couldn't follow. And that's exactly what the army became for me, a silent forge. No applause, no spectators, just steel grit and the slow unmaking of who I'd been. Basic training stripped everything. Comfort, vanity. The name Eleanor was replaced by my last, Bennett. At first I clung to it like a raft. Later it became armour. We woke before the sun ran until the horizon blurred, folded our pain into silence. I wasn't the strongest, but I noticed patterns who faltered first where the terrain gave under boots, how the drill sergeants rotated their wrath. I passed because I studied the system like a machine, but that didn't mean it didn't break me. After basic, I was funneled into intelligence analysis, top percentile in cognitive endurance, pattern recognition, situational prediction, which meant endless data streams, surveillance tapes, intercepted signals, chatter. I lived inside numbers and shadows. At first, it was thrilling. Every red dot on a screen meant lives. Every decrypted line could prevent a roadside bomb or airstrike misfire. But then came the moment it didn't. The op was in Kandahar. I was 2 hours late decrypting a key phrase in a radio intercept. By the time we flagged it, a team had already been deployed. One of our units was ambushed. 3 soldiers lost. I saw their names scroll by in the report. I hadn't met them, but I knew I should have saved them. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor of my bunk knees to chest hands cold despite the desert heat. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. My screen stared back empty. I wrote a letter home. Not to Margaret or Vanessa, to Dad. I told him everything, the failure, the guilt, how I wasn't sure if I deserved this job. I even signed it Love Elena as if I was still someone he'd loved once. But then I looked at the envelope, and I saw it landing in his mailbox tucked between bills and flyers. I imagined him opening it, skimming it, frowning slightly, then folding it closed and tossing it into a drawer. I tore it up. That's when I stopped trying to explain myself to people who had no interest in understanding. The next day, an envelope was slid under my door. No name on the front. Just one line inside, scrawled in uneven block letters. You saved us. 3rd Platoon. Your analysis rerouted our convoy. We owe you our lives. Below it, a list of names. 5 of them. I read it again and again. Not the praise, but the gratitude. It landed differently. Heavier, quieter, real. After that, the name started circulating. Ghost Compass. Someone had called me that in passing, and it stuck. The analysts who never slept, the pilots who flew blind through danger zones, the team leaders who rerouted missions. When things went right, someone would whisper, "Thank the compass." I didn't need a spotlight. I became the one behind the screen, the one behind the curtain, the one behind survival. Still, there were moments it broke through. One evening, returning from a 36-hour shift, I passed a group of infantry guys in the mess hall. One of them, young, maybe 19, stood and saluted. "Ma'am," he said simply. I paused, confused. "You ran Op Red Echo, right?" I nodded slowly. He smiled. "My brother was in that unit. He made it home. He said you were the reason." I just nodded again and walked away. I didn't know what to do with that kind of truth. Every day, in that windowless base, I built maps in my mind, pieced together whispers into meaning, and every night I reminded myself, they don't have to know your name to trust your compass. In the army, I wasn't Elena Bennett, the quiet one, the disappointment. I was something else entirely. I was the line between chaos and order. I was the silent warning, the whisper that saved. Right back into Eleanor's world we go. I was something else entirely. I was the line between chaos and order. I was the silent warning, the whisper that saved. And then I was just a daughter again, carrying a duffel bag up polished steps, standing on a doormat that read, "Home is where the wine is," while no one opened the door. I'd landed at Seattle-Tacoma that morning, 3 weeks back from deployment, bringing with me a small box of sweets from a local base bakery, dry preserved but thoughtful, and a scarf embroidered by a young girl whose village we helped stabilize. In my mind, they were peace offerings, symbols of distance crossed, but to Linda, they were clutter. "Maybe give those to Mr. Martinez next door," she said, eyebrows, arched lips, pursed like she was sparing me from embarrassment. "He's always tinkering in the garden. Might enjoy something exotic." I smiled politely, but inside, even my gifts don't belong in this house. Vanessa arrived just in time to catch Linda mid-judgment. She swept through the front hallway in heels, far too high for empathy, her voice already rising as she greeted her friends on speakerphone. Yes, she's here. No, I haven't asked, of course I won't. If anything leaks about where she's been, we'll need to loop in crisis comms. Her tone was half amused, half annoyed, like I was a PR grenade she kept under a silk napkin. You know how these military types can be. One headline and suddenly, you're the family of the drone whisperer. She laughed. I set the box of sweets on the hallway table neatly beside a bowl of designer potpourri. It looked out of place like I did. Vanessa turned to me after hanging up. "You'll be in the small guest room," she said, not asking. "We're saving the suite for Mum and Dad. and Thomas and Kate are bringing the baby, so they'll need the second largest. I nodded even as the image of the suite flashed in my mind, the skylight, the king bed, the tub I'd once sunk into for hours after Linda's birthday party 5 years ago. Sure, I said. Happy to stay where there's space. She smiled like I'd passed a test I didn't know was being administered. Perfect. I knew you'd be low maintenance. The room was the same. Small bed, view of the neighbour's siding, a half-used lavender candle on the nightstand, as if trying too hard to feel curated. I set down my gear, carefully folded, always ready, and opened my laptop to finish reviewing Intel summaries out of habit. But the screen blinked like it belonged to another life. In this house, that version of me didn't matter. The woman in the mirror. She was back to being Eleanor Carter, the extra guest, the afterthought. Dinner that night was a casual gathering, which in Vanessa's terms meant floral tablecloths, placed cards and wine with syllables I couldn't pronounce. Linda insisted I sit next to her, not out of warmth, but placement. "You can help serve," she said brightly. "Your arms are strong, I imagine." I passed trays and poured wine like I was still on KP duty, and no one blinked. When conversation turned to someone's vacation to Tuscany and someone else's new executive coach, Vanessa leaned toward her friends and whispered, "Not quietly enough. I just hope no one asks what campaign she's been on." I'd hate to have to Google her own resume. More laughter, a subtle glance toward me. I was a curiosity, a risk. I excused myself early, citing jet lag. The truth was simpler. I missed silence. Real silence. The kind you learn to respect when you're in a tent between hills, waiting on coordinates that might save lives. Back upstairs in my assigned room, I opened the drawer to find a framed family photo tucked inside. I almost laughed. It was from Vanessa's graduation. She, in her cap and gown radiant, Linda and Dad flanking her proud. Me, cut off on the edge, my face sliced by the frame, only a shoulder and partial arm remaining. Like I'd leaned in too far. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. Maybe that's why the room felt so familiar. But I didn't cry. I didn't tear the photo. I left it there, a relic of their composition. My life had grown outside that frame, and whether they saw it or not, I was no longer waiting to be centered. That night, I slept with the window open, breathing in air that didn't belong to them. A storm rolled in. I welcomed it. I'd slept through worse, and yet I couldn't sleep. The echo of Linda's words dog food hung in my head sharper than thunder. Morning arrived on stiff-legged silence. I dressed in the uniform I'd changed out of weeks before, then shed it again for civilian clothes that would be acceptable here. I slipped the military-issue cookies into my purse, tough, grainy biscuits, baked in shifts meant to nourish, but not delight. They felt like pieces of another life, a life that meant something compressed into dry crumbs. I joined the family in the dining room where Vanessa had orchestrated the seating. I sat between Aunt Marianne and Cousin Drake, both polite but distant. My plate, a white porcelain piece etched with gold, felt too pristine, too staged. Conversations hummed around me like flies around honey. Aunt Marianne asked, "So Eleanor heard you've been doing a lot of keyboard work for the army." She smiled. Filing reports, crunching numbers sounds thrilling. The table tittered. I didn't laugh. In that moment, I felt a twinge, the same sharp pain I'd felt when Linda dismissed my olive wood bookmarks as flea market junk. Instead, I lifted my chin, opened my mouth and replied with a calm I hadn't known I could summon. "Actually, I lead intelligence analysis teams. Our work-directed troop movement saved lives." My voice was quiet, but firm. The room paused, forks halting mid-air. Drake, a kid more comfortable with screens than conversation, looked at me. "Seriously?" he asked, curiosity softening his features. But Cousin Alicia chimed in before I could elaborate. "Isn't it true your work is mostly typing?" She pressed her tone edged with condescension. A rain spattered against the window, urgency tapping in Morse code. I caught Drake's eye, a challenge, an invitation to show them better than they expected. I smiled politely at Alicia. It's detailed work, I said. Data drives decisions. If we get it wrong, people die. A hush took hold heavier than grief. Aunt Marianne nodded. Cleopatra soft. That does sound important. Then, little Emma, Vanessa's goddaughter, leaned forward, innocence embroidered in her eyes. Aunt, Eleanor, is it true your mum said you're a bad person? Her voice trembled, not malicious, just echoing the damaging rumours Linda had instilled months ago in Emma's head. The room gasped. I looked at Emma, knelt down beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. No, sweetheart, I said gently. I'm not a bad person. I just do hard things to help people. Her eyes glistened and she squeezed my hand. Margaret cleared her throat. That's enough. Her voice lacked conviction. Then Linda the queen bee cut in. Why didn't you bring actual food? These cookies look like she paused smooth as ice dog treats. She smiled like she'd made a clever quip and everyone should laugh. Crickets chirped. Another storm roll of thunder outside louder now. I swallowed my own laughter. A shift was happening and it wasn't just the weather. I looked around the table. My voice tightened. These cookies fed my unit during a 14-hour operation yesterday. We don't bake them for flavour. We bake them to endure. A silence. In that pause, I felt every gaze shift, some with understanding, some with discomfort. Vanessa bit her lip. Dad looked away. Even Margaret's smile seemed to flicker. I caught Drake's eye again. He nodded, then curiosity giving way to respect. Emma's hand remained in mine, a declaration. I stood. Excuse me, I said softly, stepped back and walked to the window. I brushed my fingers against the rain-streaked glass, felt the echo of chaos meet my calm centre. Then I returned to the table and silently walked away. I wasn't angry. I was neither defeated nor triumphant. I was measured. And in that measured decision, I reclaimed the power they'd tried to define. That evening, I retreated upstairs, poured a glass of water, and placed the rest of the cookies, still in their military wrap, on the nightstand. Tomorrow, I'd return to base, where truth wasn't optional, and character had weight. But tonight, in the battlefield of family, I had made my claim. They could choose to ignore it, but they would no longer dismiss it. I didn't hear the doorbell at first. The clinking of forks and the low buzz of voices blurred together like background noise until it rang again, sharp, unexpected. Vanessa's brow furrowed. "Who the hell comes unannounced?" she muttered, wiping her perfectly glossed lips with a cloth napkin. Mark, our father, rose from his seat, but Brian beat him to it. "I've got it," he said, with a practiced charm slipping from the dining room. I reached for my glass of water, already bracing for a new round of passive aggression from someone. Instead, what entered the room moments later was silence, the kind that folds over a crowd like a dropped curtain. Heavy, expectant. Brian stepped back, in eyes-wide posture stiff. Eleanor? Someone's here? For you?" I blinked. For me? No one ever came for me. That was the whole point. Then I saw him. Daniel, Vanessa's son, my nephew, 24, in full military dress uniform shoes, polished posture straight cap tucked under his arm. He looked taller than I remembered, broader. His presence didn't just fill the room, it recalibrated it. "Major Eleanor Carter," he said, voice crisp, cutting through the air like a blade, "reporting per orders from Colonel Ramsey. Immediate operational briefing required." And then he saluted, full salute, to me. The room didn't know whether to gasp or blink. Vanessa's wine glass trembled in her hand. Brian's jaw slackened. Linda leaned forward, slightly unsure if this was theatre or truth. Major, someone repeated. "Uncle Dave, I think. Wait, she's not just logistics." Daniel didn't flinch. "Major Carter leads strategic intel teams under US Special Operations Command. Her decisions have saved my unit more than once." Then, quieter, but not for our ears alone. "She's why I'm still standing here. It was too much. and just enough. I rose, slowly returning his salute. Thank you, Lieutenant. The room still hadn't recovered. Vanessa opened her mouth, then shut it. Linda clutched her napkin like a lifeline. My father Mark sat as if he'd been slapped. We'll speak outside, I said, my voice calm, but laced with something colder. Daniel nodded and held the door open. As we stepped into the hallway, the weight behind us remained suspended. 12 people stuck mid-chew in the ruins of their superiority. Outside, the porch light buzzed faintly. Daniel exhaled, finally dropping the formality. Sorry for the drama, he said. But Aunt Elena, they had to see it. They had to know. I shook my head, half laughing. You didn't have to do all this. He shrugged hands behind his back. Sarah called me. She said she couldn't watch them erase you again. His jaw clenched. Neither could I. For a second, I didn't speak. I couldn't. Then, softly, you didn't just walk into that house for me, Daniel. You walked in for every quiet kid who was told they were never enough. He looked down, then reached into his jacket pocket. I found this, he said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. In Mom's drawer last year. I thought it was trash, but it had your name on it. I took it, hands suddenly shaky, unfolded it slowly. It was the sketch my drawing of Lily, my mother, the one Linda had called grim and boyish, the one that disappeared. She kept it, I whispered. Daniel nodded. She didn't understand it, but she didn't throw it away. It hit me like wind across scorched desert, unexpected, strange a shift. We stood quietly for a moment longer. Then I said, Tell Colonel Ramsay I'll be ready for the morning brief. Show 700. Daniel grinned. He'll be glad. Your mind saved more pilots than radar. He saluted again, this time shorter, warmer. See you soon, Major. I watched him walk off, his silhouette straight against the shadows. When I stepped back inside, all eyes turned to me, but none quite dared speak. I returned to my seat, picked up my fork, and finished my food in silence. No one asked me another question. No one dared. Later, when the table cleared and the night began to unravel, my father pulled me aside. His voice was quieter than I remembered. That was something he said. Daniel's speech. It wasn't a speech, I replied. It was truth. He nodded slowly. I didn't know. You never asked, I said gently, and walked away. Back in my room, the small one with the creaky twin bed, I sat on the edge, turning the sketch of Lily in my hands. Then I slid it into an envelope, scribbled Daniel on the front, and slipped it into the pocket of his coat by the door before anyone noticed. A thank you. And a message. You saw me. You always had. He didn't open it right away. Instead, we walked down the hall toward the kitchen, voices low, padded by the muffled party noise behind us. The hallway smelled like polished wood and old socks. Vanessa had a habit of leaving sandals in corners, and I realised I hadn't felt this grounded in years. Sarah called me before dinner, he said quietly, his tone guarded. She knew this night was going sideways. Said you needed one moment they couldn't rewrite. She insisted I come dressed, salute everything. He paused, rubbing the strap of his uniform bag. She said, You're done being a rumour. I nodded, thinking of Sarah back at base, fierce-eyed and defiant. Someone who'd defended me when the rest of the world ignored the calls. She always had my back, I said simply. Daniel swallowed. Then she told me what happened in Kandahar. His voice shook like an aftershock. She said the intel you provided saved my platoon. Every one of us. We flew straight into hell anti-aircraft insurgent ambush, the whole chaotic mess. Your code lit the path. He looked at me, eyes bright with emotion. That's why I had to bring truth here. Not drama, not speeches. Truth. My chest tightened, warm pride mingled with regret. All those years of being overlooked only to be that person who stood between life and death. What they heard tonight, it wasn't for me. It was for the mission, I told him. He reached forward and squeezed my shoulder firmly. That's exactly why they needed to hear it. Then, he added softly, Sarah doesn't hate Vanessa, you know. I raised an eyebrow. That came across loud and clear. He shuffled uncomfortably. She thinks Vanessa always needed stages and photo ops. Maybe she resented how Vanessa performed recognition, not earned it. So yes, she wanted to crash the party, but not with fire. She wanted facts. I exhaled, leaning my back against the wall behind us. Faded family portraits lined the hallway weddings' birthdays, a younger Vanessa hugging a balloon-clad Eleanor. That version of me looked lost and visible. This version, she was standing taller. Thanks to Sarah, and to you. Daniel looked down then. I should tell them more. But his voice trailed off. They're still inside. I nodded. Let them digest. Let them wonder. And when they're ready, we'll let the hallway speak again. He gave me a half smile. I'll be there. Always. We returned to the living room, but something had changed. Not just in the air, but in the posture of the people. Dad no longer leaned back with half-closed eyes. Linda had stopped tapping her ring against her wine glass. Vanessa was folding napkins that didn't need folding. Daniel excused himself politely, said he had to call base, but really he was giving me space. Letting me sit in the aftermath of what truth had just done to a house built on narrative. I found myself wandering. Through the hallway again, into the den. Past the upright piano, none of us really played. I paused in front of the bookshelf, tracing my finger along the spine of a book I once loved as a child, The Compass Rose. It was about a girl who got lost in the woods and had to learn to read signs no one else could see. There was something poetic about finding it here, still shelved, still intact, like the parts of me they'd ignored had quietly survived. Your mother gave you that, a voice said behind me. It was Dad. He looked older now, not aged by time, but by hesitation. I remember, I replied, not turning around. She said you read it over and over, that you said the girl in the book reminded you of you. His voice cracked. Maybe I should have paid more attention. I finally turned. You did what you could, I said, but the words didn't taste quite right. Too forgiving, too easy. No, he said, shaking his head. I didn't. I let Linda fill in the blanks. I let Vanessa speak louder. I told myself you were fine because you never complained. That was the point, I whispered. I didn't complain because I knew no one was listening. A long silence stretched between us. Not cruel, just weighty. He nodded slowly. I hear you now. And for the first time in decades, I believed him. Not fully. Not as redemption, but as a beginning. Back in the hallway, Daniel waited, coat in hand. They'll keep rewriting, you know, he said, trying to edit their memories into safer shapes. I know, I said, stepping beside him. But there'll be kids like Lily, he added. They'll draw the truth crayon-coloured and raw. They'll remember what didn't fit the frame. I smiled. That's why we don't shout. We lead. Daniel hesitated, then pulled the envelope from his coat pocket. I read it, he said. Your sketch. I'll keep it. Pass it on someday, I told him, when someone else needs to feel seen. He tapped his temple, already noted, and with that he left. Back inside, the lights dimmed. Dessert plates scraped empty. Vanessa approached, lips parted like she was rehearsing something. Elena, she began. But I raised a hand. Not tonight. She flinched, but didn't argue. I walked past her, calm, collected. I had said what needed to be said. Not with speeches, but with presence. Not with accusations, but with undeniable being. And for the first time in this house, I wasn't holding my breath. I was breathing my name. The knock on the base's civilian gate came at 10:07 a.m. a Thursday. I'd just returned from a strategy session, my uniform still crisp, the echo of mission briefings fresh in my ears. when the sergeant buzzed my office and said, "Ma'am, there's a visitor asking for you. Civilian? Says her name is Vanessa Hart." I blinked like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. Vanessa. Here. At my base. I'd known surreal late-night ops intercepted threats that made my pulse spike, but nothing quite prepared me for the image that met me at the visitor checkpoint. There she was, Vanessa in heels that clacked against concrete like defiance, a perfectly tailored coat that didn't know what to do with the wind out here, hair too perfect for the Pacific's cold breath. Her arms were crossed tight, clutching a leather bag like a lifeline. She stood there, as if waiting to be seated at a rooftop brunch, not outside a military facility, layered in security protocols and coded silence. I paused behind the tinted glass before opening the door. I had the upper hand now, and we both knew it. When I stepped into view, she startled just slightly, but gathered herself fast. "Eleanor," she said, then caught herself. "Major Carter, I mean." I nodded. "Vanessa. What brings you to the edge of classified airspace in 3-inch stilettos?" She let out a breath, part exasperation, part nerves. "Can we talk?" I took her to a briefing room. No windows, just 4 walls, a table and chairs, too stiff for comfort. A far cry from her marble counters and velvet cushions. She sat slower than usual, like the chair might betray her. "I know I wasn't invited," she said. Her tone was flat, uncertain. "Daniel? Well, he said he wouldn't come home again unless I saw for myself." "Saw you?" She stopped, then looked straight at me. "He said you've been saving people while we were too busy comparing gala menus." I didn't reply, just let the silence fill the room. "I'm not used to being the one out of place," she admitted. "But I think that's the point." I sat across from her, arms folded. Daniel made quite the entrance. "You raised a good one." She swallowed. "He's angry. At me. For how I've talked about you. For what I never asked." She unzipped her bag slowly, almost reluctantly, and drew out something wrapped in velvet. "I didn't come here to make things right with words. I know they're not enough." She unwrapped it. A small silver bracelet. A child's. Bent slightly out of shape, a charm missing. My breath caught before I could catch it. "I found it," she said, "when you were 12. You thought you lost it during summer camp. You cried for 3 days." I remembered. That bracelet had been a gift from my biological mother before she died. I'd worn it like a talisman, and when it disappeared, I thought maybe the universe was just making things official. She was gone, and I was no one's daughter now. "I kept it," Vanessa continued, voice low. "I don't know why. Maybe I liked having something of yours that you wanted so badly. I didn't mean to be cruel, but I never gave it back either." She placed it on the table between us. I didn't know what it meant. I do now. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the base's generator. I stared at the bracelet. Part of me wanted to reach for it. Part of me wanted to leave it there and walk away. "I'm sorry," she said simply. No performance, no clever smile. Just my sister unarmed for once. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at her coat, her carefully curled hair, her trembling fingers. She had left her comfort zone, driven miles in silence, walked into my world without makeup for her role. "Why now?" I asked. Because I saw what I couldn't unsee. You. The way Daniel saluted. The way he looks at you like the world depends on your next word. And I realized I'd never looked at you at all. Not really. I leaned back, watching her closely. "Daniel said he wouldn't come home." She nodded. "He said if I didn't at least try to see you, he didn't know if we had anything left to talk about." I smiled faintly. "Seems the boy grew a spine." She chuckled, wiped at her eye before mascara betrayed her. "He got that from you, I think." I shook my head. "No, he got it because someone finally treated him like he had one." A silence stretched between us again. Not hostile, not quite healed either, but different. I'm not ready, I finally said, fingers brushing the bracelet. But thank you for stepping out of your castle. Vanessa stood, nodded. I'll wait. If ever you want to talk, or don't, either way I'll be here. As she walked out, her heels echoed softer. Less like a queen, more like a sister searching for footing. And I sat alone with a silver bracelet in front of me, and a future I hadn't expected, one where maybe healing didn't come with fireworks, but with footsteps on concrete. 2 days later, the bracelet was tucked away in a drawer. Not hidden, not displayed. Just kept like a letter you're not ready to reread, but can't bring yourself to throw away. Vanessa texted twice after that visit. One message said, "Thank you for seeing me." The other, "I'd like to start again if you'll let me." I read them both, then left them unanswered. Not to punish her, but because starting again would mean going back, and I had already moved forward. At 1900 hours sharp that Friday, Sarah and I walked into the bar just outside the base. It was the kind of place with sticky floors and a jukebox that always leaned towards Springsteen or old Johnny Cash, but the drinks were strong and no one asked questions. Sarah slid into the booth across from me, her braid still damp from the rain. So she said, lifting her glass, "I heard a high-heeled ghost paid you a visit." I smirked. She walked like she owned the runway, but her heels cracked on concrete. Sarah clinked her glass to mine. "To battles we choose to fight." I took a long sip, then nodded. "And the ones we finally walk away from." The booth light was dim, casting long shadows across our faces. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small photo, sliding it across the table. "Thought you might want this. Lieutenant Green took it last mission. You were covered in dust, laughing like someone who forgot war existed." I picked it up. There I was, smeared with mud helmet slightly crooked, and Sarah grinning beside me like she'd just told the world's most inappropriate joke. It wasn't posed. It wasn't filtered. It was real. "I don't remember laughing that day," I said. "That's because you were too busy saving everyone else," Sarah replied. I held the photo a moment longer, then tucked it into my inside pocket. I already knew where I'd place it, right next to my work terminal. Right where I'd see it every time I pulled another encrypted file or reviewed satellite data at 3 a.m. It would be my reminder I wasn't made of their silence. I was shaped by my own resilience. In that photo, I saw more than camaraderie. I saw family. Not the one that forgot me, but the one that found me when I stopped looking for approval. Later that night, as we walked back under a sky streaked with wind, Sarah slowed. "You gonna call her back?" she asked almost gently. "No," I said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." She nodded. "Didn't push. You don't owe anyone your peace." I turned toward her. "I forgave her," I said, "but forgiveness doesn't mean access. It doesn't mean I forget the empty seats, the missing names, the smiles that never quite reached me." Sarah smiled. "That's why you're still standing. Because you don't let the door hit you, but you also don't prop it open." The wind kicked up, and we kept walking, hands in our pockets, not needing to say much else. There's a kind of quiet that feels like closure, not a slam, not a bang, just a soft click that says, this chapter is done. The following week, I received a parcel in the mail. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably Vanessa's. Inside was a hardcover book, The Compass Rose, a collector's edition, leather-bound, gold embossed. I flipped to the front and found a note tucked inside. I thought of the woods you had to navigate alone. Maybe next time you won't have to. V. I stared at it for a long moment, fingers resting on the paper. It was thoughtful, painstaking, but even kindness, when long overdue, can feel like touching something hot. You're grateful for the warmth, but still flinch from the burn. I put the book on my shelf. Not hidden, but not central. That evening, a younger officer, Lieutenant Kim, knocked on my door. "Major," she said, holding a thermos and looking uncertain, "I just wanted to thank you." for what you said in the simulation debrief. It stuck with me. I waved her in. We talked. Not about strategy or operations, but about doubt, about belonging, about how many of us show up armoured in silence. When she left, she smiled and said, "I hope one day someone sees me the way your team sees you." It wasn't pride I felt. It was resonance. Like my scars were finally a map someone else could use to get out. Later at midnight, I opened my inbox. Vanessa had sent another message. Just one line: "I never deserved your forgiveness, but I hope your future does." I didn't reply, but I also didn't delete it. Because sometimes letting go means leaving the bridge unburnt, but choosing not to cross it. Back in my quarters, I placed the photo on my desk. Right beneath it, I stuck a small note in my own handwriting. "You are not their absence. You are your own presence." Then I turned off the light, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't dream of proving anything, I just slept. Then I turned off the light, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't dream of proving anything, I just slept. The next morning, I brewed coffee and stood by the window of my quarters, watching early fog snake between the barracks. Quiet like this had once unnerved me, like something was waiting to drop. But now it felt like breath. A pause I didn't have to earn. Around 8:00 a.m., my inbox pinged. I expected a mission brief. Instead, it was a forwarded photo from a neighbour back home. There was Linda, perched in her book club circle, proudly holding up a printed newspaper article. The caption beneath read, "Major Elena Carter, the ghost compass behind Operation Griffin." It was the same Linda who once rolled her eyes at my training, who had once told me real women don't wear boots to dinner. And now she was offering wine and literary quotes over my name. I didn't know whether to laugh or shut the laptop. She wasn't proud of me. She was proud to be near me now that others saw me. Around noon, the phone buzzed. Dad's number. I stared at it a long moment, then answered. "Eleanor," he said, as if testing the name on his tongue. I saw the paper, and Daniel. He told me things. About you. Things I never knew. His voice cracked slightly. "I didn't know how much you mattered. But I do now." I let the silence hold. "I'm sorry," he added. "I should have said that sooner. You didn't know I repeated, but I did. That's the difference." He sighed. "I just want a chance to fix things." "I don't need things fixed," I said. "I needed that when I was 12, 16. But now I built something without your applause. I survived without your yes." The line went quiet, like he didn't know what to say when his old tools no longer worked. "I see you now," he said finally. "Then keep looking. Don't blink. No goodbyes, no soft fades, just truth." 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived. Linda's handwriting. "Join us for Sunday brunch. You'll be the guest of honour." Guest of honour. As if I was some visiting dignitary, not the daughter they forgot for decades. Sarah read over my shoulder and muttered, "You don't owe them your Sunday." She was right. Sunday came. I didn't go. Instead, I laced my boots and hiked the trail behind the base, the one that wound above the airstrip and made the world feel wider. At the top, I stood alone with wind in my lungs and no one to ask me to shrink. On the way back, I stopped at a diner, sat at the counter, ordered pancakes and coffee, and when the waitress asked if I was dining alone, I nodded without flinching. That afternoon, Dad sent another message, just a photo me at 8, holding a book at a family picnic half cropped out of frame. He'd scrawled below, "I see now what I missed then." I stared at it, then hit delete. Because recognition when it comes too late is still just a shadow of presence, and I was tired of being grateful for shadows. Later that week, I passed the training fields and spotted a young cadet, Lieutenant Marsh, struggling with her rifle stance. I adjusted her grip, corrected her footwork. She looked up surprised. Thanks, Mom. I didn't think anyone was watching. I watch the quiet ones, I said. They're the ones carrying the most weight. She smiled. You always know. I used to be you. She nodded, then ran again, steadier, surer. That night, I sat at my desk beneath the soft desk lamp photo of me and Sarah, beside the terminal bracelet tucked in a drawer and a new note taped above the keyboard. You are not their absence. You are your own presence. Below it, I added another, forgiveness doesn't mean access. They were turning now, Linda, Dad, even Vanessa, turning back to look at what they missed. But I wasn't waiting for them to catch up, because I wasn't their unfinished business. I was my own arrival. 2 weeks later, a small brown package arrived at my quarters. No frills, no ribbon. Just my name in Daniel's handwriting and the words, "Open this when you need to remember who you are." I opened it carefully. Inside was a framed photo me and Daniel, standing side by side in full dress uniform. The lighting was bad, and my braid was a little crooked, but the look on both our faces was unshakable. Confident. Earned. Under the photo, in black marker, he'd written, "Keep being a badass, Major Carter." I smiled. Not the kind you practice for cameras, the kind that starts behind your ribs and softens something old. That same afternoon, an official letter slid into my inbox invitation to serve as a visiting lecturer at West Point course title Strategic Intelligence and Adaptive Command. I stared at the subject line longer than I needed to rereading the word invite like it was written in a new language. I accepted. On my first day, walking through the long halls of that academy, I wore my full uniform. Not because I needed the stripes, but because I had earned every single thread. Students stood as I entered the room. One cadet whispered to another, "That's her, the ghost compass." I didn't respond. I just nodded, placed my notes on the podium, and began with the sentence I'd waited a lifetime to say. I was once the quietest voice in the room. Now, you'll listen because I made silence strategic. Each lecture wasn't just theory, it was testament. I spoke of missions no one clapped for, of nights spent watching maps instead of sleeping, of decisions that didn't earn medals but saved lives. I didn't teach to impress, I taught to prepare. And slowly, the cadets began to understand that leadership wasn't volume. It was vision, not dominance, but depth. After class one day, a female student lingered. Her name tag read Reyes. "Mom," she said, "what if no one sees you?" I paused, then said, "They don't have to. You see you. That's where it starts." She nodded. I could see the weight she carried, a weight I knew too well. Later that week, I stood outside the lecture hall watching the sunset spill across the quad. Sarah had sent a text earlier, "Miss your laugh, Carter." "Drink soon," I replied. "Always. Make it strong." A voice behind me said, "Permission to speak freely, Ma'am." I turned. It was one of the senior cadets, Morris. "Go ahead. You're not like the others. You talk like it's real, like it costs something." "It did," I said. "But I'd pay it again." He nodded, saluted sharply. And for a moment, I felt something shift. Not status, not praise, but understanding. The quiet kind. The kind you don't earn in banquets, but on floors lined with fatigue and choices. That night, I walked back to my quarters alone. The halls were quiet. No applause, no spotlight. Just the click of my boots against stone and the echo of a life finally in rhythm. On my desk sat the photo Daniel had sent. I looked at it again, how straight we stood, how deeply we belonged. And I thought about the girl who once clutched a paintbrush and was told her art was too dark, too sharp, too much. I placed the frame beside the one of Sarah and me, and underneath them both I added one last note. I was the empty seat once. Now I am the one they rise for. Because that's the truth no spotlight can rewrite. I am not the decoration to anyone's story. I am the force behind its turn. So no, I don't need their applause. I have the salute, and it was never about the uniform. It was about becoming someone who could stand in a room full of echoes and still hear her own name. I was once the empty chair at the family table. Now, I'm the one fighter pilots salute with both hands. Not because of the lights, but because of the gravity that can't be denied. Drop your stories in the comments. If you've ever been the quiet one at the table, I see you.